So good evening. Thanks to Liz for leading the meditation. Thanks to Barb for honoring our volunteers. I want to talk tonight about working with fear, and both from the perspective of the Dharma, sort of what the Buddha taught about it, and some modern psychology as well. But there's a tremendous amount of overlap there. The Buddha was really an amazing scientist in terms of foreseeing what modern psychology has rediscovered in terms of how he thought about things like working with fear and other challenging emotions. And the issue is, how do we do this? How do we maintain some modicum of equanimity in a world that is just filled with fear of what's going to happen to the planet, fear of political fear, upheaval in the world, shootings, natural disasters, all of these things that we live with every day and that the news just bombards us with every day. Fear is a natural part of humanity. It's a natural part of being human. And the challenge for us, I think, is not to let it consume us. It's an important aspect of our survival. It certainly was essential to the survival of our ancient ancestors. The tribe that didn't worry about or didn't fear having enough food or didn't fear having shelter or protection didn't survive very long. So it's not, it gets a bum rap, but it's essential to our survival. The problem is many of those things which our ancient ancestors had to contend with, we don't have to contend with. And so we have this residual propensity, this residual tendency to experience fear when it's really not, our survival is really not at stake. Fear is kind of a generic, broad term. It's somewhat imprecise, so I want to be a little more specific and break it down a little bit. Fear is really in the moment. It's a physiological response. Typically, the amygdala, the part of the brain that's sort of the fire alarm, kicks in. It's precognitive in the sense that we react before we think. We see something in this. This classic example is we see something in the path in front of us that appears to be a snake. We react as though it's a snake, and then we have a chance to look and think and see that it's a crooked stick. But the fear it sort of bypasses or precedes our cognition because we don't want to waste time if survival's at stake with thinking or problem solving. We want to react in a way that's necessary to preserve our safety, and then we can process it after the fact. Barb could attest to that tonight, as she said she got an upsetting phone call and the response was immediate, and then she had a chance to process it. But it takes the body a while to settle back down. When we get hit with that surge of adrenaline, it really can be quite compelling. So fear is a feeling of doom, unease, apprehensiveness in response to an imminent danger. It's in the moment. Anxiety, on the other hand, is anticipatory. It's imagining what's going to happen. It's a feeling of doom when no danger is imminently present, but when we anticipate that there might be something. So I have a fear of closed spaces. I anticipate if I get in an elevator, I'm going to experience anxiety or fear. So it's anticipatory in nature. And then stress is sort of the broad term, which is the body's, the physical response, the symptoms that come with it, the sweaty palms, the increased heart rate, the rapid breathing, the sweating, all the fearful, scary thoughts that accompany it. When I was putting the talk together, I was reminded of the 5 hindrances. You'll remember the 5 hindrances that the Buddha talked about. And it occurred to me that 3 of the 5 have an element of fear. So the first one is sort of greed, sensual desire, not so much, but ill will and aversion. Fear is really an aversive response. It results in our wanting to get away from something, avoid something, move away. So that's impacted by fear. Sloth and torpor, not at all. Really, probably the antithesis of fear, anxiety. But restlessness and worry would certainly come under the large heading of fear. And then doubt can also be fed by fear or be conjoined with fear. So a certain amount of anxiety is necessary in our lives. I mean, it motivates us. It keeps us from putting ourselves in dangerous situations. It results in our clicking our seatbelts on, or taking our medication, or not walking down dark alleys in the middle of the night. It also helps us adhere to social norms. So it impacts our behavioral choices in terms of how we act around our peers, each other. So again, I don't want to paint it as this negative thing, even though it's certainly unpleasant. I mean, all of us have had experiences of fear. It's not fun. But what often happens as we begin a spiritual path and as our spiritual practice deepens, fears begin to come up. This happens a lot on longer retreats when we sit for a long time and get very quiet. Very often old, largely sometimes unconscious fears start to bubble up. So it becomes very much part of the challenge of our spiritual practice. And I think it asks us to be alert and aware and conscious of our fears as a way of moving on along the path. Part of the reason for that is to give some meaning to what otherwise would be just purposeless suffering. Rather than trying to understand it, work with it, make some sense of it. If we just feel it, don't try to work with it, we're just going to suffer. We're not going to make any progress on our spiritual path. It's important to remember that fear, anxiety, these various states that involve sympathetic arousal, as you recall, the fight, flight, or freeze response, are subjective. They're internal. We feel them internally. They're not necessarily even visible to anyone else. They may be if we're in a full panic mode. It may be apparent to other people because we'll be trembling. My dog is terrified of thunderstorms, and we had one the other night, and it's pretty clear she's in a state of hyper-arousal because she's trembling and panting and is really not soothable at those times until the storm passes. But normally for us human beings, it's very subjective, it's very internal. And the more we recognize that, and the more we recognize that we can work with this state mindfully, with our practice, with our meditation practice, then we can begin to manage it, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways we can do that. And it's less likely to escalate than from just general apprehension into full-blown anxiety or even terror and panic. In other words, we learn to be with fear, with anxiety, as we do with any other experience in our practice. We talk a lot about learning to be with certain states of mind, states that come up, and fear and anxiety are no different. And the key really is to not identify with it, I am a fearful person, as opposed to fear is happening, fear is like this. Ajahn Sumedho says that we can do a mental notation, which is anxiety is like this, fear is like this, not to become identified with it, but just recognize it, label it, and keep from getting over-identified with it. Very often with anxiety, as I said a little while ago, it's anticipatory in nature. We anticipate dreadful outcomes, some of which are based in reality. The human frailty, impermanence, the temporary nature of our existence, and the existence of those we love. I mean, these are very real things that usually generate a fear response in terms of the human experience. The idea being that if our goal is to be absolutely safe, we're never going to achieve that. It's not achievable. So we have to recognize the fear, embrace the fear, work with the fear, see, and that's part of this practice, to accept and embrace those things over which we have no control, like aging, death, illness, and the like. So the price of really being a conscious human being and being awake in the sense of our practice is that it brings with it a realization of these things which generate a sense of fear in us. The recognition of the frailty of life, the temporariness of our existence. With that can come a vulnerability. I mean, it's easy to feel vulnerable in the face of that. But again, this is where I think our practice and the acceptance of it, that this is what it is, helps us from being swept up in it and just being swept along by it. It's really learning to be with it, to just sit with it, to be present with it. And we do this consciously. We don't allow it just to blindside us, sneak up on us, bite us on the ankle kind of thing. We consciously engage with it. We try to avoiding it. We try to avoid denying it. We try to avoid pushing it away. Those are really seen as unskillful ways, unskillful means of dealing with fear and anxiety. The idea being the less you want it, the more you're going to have it kind of thing. What we know about fear is if we attempt to push it away or suppress it, it's sort of like a tea kettle. It's just going to come back that much stronger. And this is where the parable of the second arrow, I think, is really relevant, because we can have a response of fear or anxiety being the first arrow. It's unpleasant. We don't like how it feels. It's uncomfortable. But then what do we do with it? The second arrow. What do we tell ourselves about it? I'm flawed. I'm defective. This is the end of the world. I'm dying. Whatever we tell ourselves, which really ramps it up. And when the Buddha talked about the second arrow, I mean, it's completely relevant and applicable to how we manage fear and anxiety in our lives. The untrained mind is typically agitated by the realities of the human condition, of the human experience. And again, the practice is a way of beginning to manage it, to reduce that agitation, to accept the uncertainty, to learn to tolerate the uncertainty in our lives. We develop confidence that life is like this. This is the way things are. Again, there's that acceptance. Relating to life as it is, just as we experience it. We can get so consumed and caught up in our fears, and again, we get inundated with things that frighten us. Just turn on the radio, turn on the television, pick up a newspaper. It's really everywhere. But it's very easy to sort of fall into what I would call a fear-based life, where we're just constantly frightened, constantly in a state of fearfulness. And when very little ever feels safe, where even feeling safe is temporary, there's no equanimity. And again, the challenge becomes how to achieve some degree of equanimity in the face of all of this input, all of this stimuli that's telling us to be afraid, that's telling us that things are dangerous and we need to fear for ourselves and those we care about. So if we live this fear-based life, we can just go from one obsession or worry to another. We can develop just a general chronic sense of anxiety. I found when I first started this practice some years ago, especially when I would go on retreat early on, that as I got quiet, it really became so clear to me how much of my own behavior was fear-driven or fear-motivated, that there was this sort of constant background hum of fear that I lived with, that I didn't really put my finger on until I began to sit and get very quiet. And then it really just it just hit me in the face. And then it began to become even more clear through additional practice, all of the things that I was fearful of. Fear of failure, fear of disapproval, fear of disappointing others, fear of fear. Just the list goes on. And that they were there with me most of my waking existence and probably most of my sleeping existence too, in terms of, and it was just so clear that was a big part of the suffering that brought me to this practice. Most of us come to this practice out of an experience of suffering, and that mine was really based in this all this fearfulness, this background hum that I'd spent much of my life contending with. But over time, the practice really begins to shift perspective. And one of the things it does is that it creates spaciousness around the fear. When we have blinders on, when we're just focused on the fear or the anxieties, with very little opportunity to see beyond the immediacy of those fears, they just tend to just loop and loop and loop like a tape in our brain. But if we begin with a practice and with our sitting practice to create some spaciousness around them, then they really begin, the grip of them really starts to loosen. And I can tell you from my own experience that's one of the promises of this practice. It doesn't eliminate the fear, it doesn't get rid of it, but it loosens the grip and it helps create some spaciousness around it where it's like, okay, this is what this is. I recognize this, I see where this is coming from. I understand this better. The Buddha talked in the Bhaya-Hibhavara Sutta, he talked about fear. Fear and dread is the translation of that sutta, and about his own work with fear. And he talked to some of the Brahmin in this sutta. He's giving a sermon to them about the qualities of a monk who lives alone in the forest. And he talked about his own experience of living in the forest and how frightening that was to him originally until with his practice, he didn't use this language, but the clear implication in the sutta is create some spaciousness around his own fearfulness of the sounds of the forest, of the animals of the forest, the snakes and whatnot, all the things that in his day were threats to one's well-being and existence. Also, if you recall the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, on the night of his enlightenment, when Mara comes to him, Mara's trying to frighten him. I mean, Mara's coming in there and saying all these horrible, scary things to him to try to interrupt his experience of enlightenment. And he did something which I think is a beautiful metaphor for sort of grounding ourselves when we're feeling fearful. He touched the earth. And as he touched the earth, Mara sort of went away, disappeared. He was sort of saying, I'm grounding. And very often we can use the experience of grounding, whether metaphorically or physically, by just feeling our connection to the earth, to the chair, to wherever we're standing or sitting, as a way of grounding ourselves if we're in the midst of a fearful experience. So what worked for me and what I find helpful and what I would recommend when we're working with this mindfully is, don't go for the biggest fear in your life. Start small, work mindfully with manageable fears incrementally. One of the things we do in modern psychology is what we call graduated exposure, when we have someone that comes in with a phobia, specific phobia, fear, something specific, is we gradually expose them to it in a way that allows them to manage it. Well, we can do that with our practice by gradually bringing to mind things when we're during our sitting practice that generate a sense of fear, and do it in a much more approachable, smaller, incremental fashion. And patience is required to do this, but by doing that, we can really begin to manage some of our fears more effectively and not be a slave to them. One of the things we would say about one of the reasons we experience fear, I think, is when we experience our sense of separateness. We talk about this sense of interconnectedness to everything, and I think when we can experience some of that, it's much less likely we're going to be fearful or anxious, because we appreciate, again, there's a spacious quality to that sense of interconnectedness. And when we feel that and when we experience that, I think it dials the fear back as well. There are those that teach that loving kindness practice is a classic antidote for fear, particularly loving kindness directed toward ourselves and whatever it is we're fearing and feeling. loving kindness softens our self-judgment, and it helps us begin to expend less energy avoiding situations which lessen our fear. It sort of steels us, if you will, to face them and be less inclined to engage in avoidant behavior. So sometimes a phrase such as, "May I find freedom from fear in my life. May I also help others find freedom from fear in their lives. And may I meet the fear in our culture with the courage of an open heart, which acts with decisiveness but never divisiveness." So some sort of a loving kindness practice with those kinds of phrases can be tremendously helpful. You may know the story from one of the suttas of a monk who lived in an isolated cave, and he painted these beautiful murals on the wall as part of his meditation practice. And as he developed a deeper concentration and became more skilled with his painting, he painted this ferocious tiger on the side of the cave. But it seemed so real that it frightened him to the point of death. He scared himself to death with it. The moral of the story is that all the things that arise in our mind are like the monk's brushstrokes on the cave wall. None of them, not even the ones that seem to be the most solid, are composed of lasting, unchanging substance. That great quote from Mark Twain, he said, "I've had some terrible things happen in my life. I've had some terrible things in my life, and some of them actually happened." That's a paraphrase, but you get the gist of it. So when we feel stuck, when we get bogged down in a specific fear or in a rut with fear, it's kind of like that painting on the wall. We need to see that as an illusion, as something which is not necessarily real, but is something that's something we've generated in our own mind. And the clinging to that, or the clinging to be free of that, which just really exacerbates it, can be a cause of great distress. We tend to hold on to it. So I would suggest that the proper response is threefold. There's a continued effort to be mindful of the fear, would be the first of the three. That we cultivate deep self-compassion for the suffering that it is causing us. I mean, self-compassion is critical to managing our fears. And then, as I said earlier, cultivating equanimity that allows us just to stay present with it. So those three steps, I think, can be tremendously helpful as we walk this path of fear. Unfortunately, I've certainly seen this with other practitioners, that very often as fear comes up, whether in their regular daily practice or on retreat, it overwhelms to the extent that they then leave the practice, they give it up. And I think that calls upon those of us that teach to do a better job of helping guide people through this process so that they don't feel so overwhelmed. I've taught retreats where people have left in the middle because of their fear had come up to such a degree that they just found it unmanageable or unbearable. And, that's something obviously that we would hope to not have happen. So what else do we do? Well, we begin to look directly at the experience of fear when it happens, right in the moment. Just let's look at it. Let's don't try to avoid it or push it away or do something that's unskillful. Let's look at it directly. What does it feel like in the body? The Buddha's first order of business is always go to the body when you're struggling with something. So where is it in the body? Where do you feel it? And how does it break down? What are the components? What are the thoughts, physical responses, sensations? is there a particular pattern to our experience of fear? Is there something that we see that sort of is predictable in how each of us respond? What form is it taking? Is it taking the form of, generalized anxiety, panic, avoidance, running away from something? So if we do this and watch things as they arise and just sit with it and be with it, it really does become manageable. It really does become less overwhelming. It really does create spaciousness in a way that can really help us be with it more effectively. So I wanted to leave a little time for some questions and discussions, but I want to close with a poem that I think is appropriate by wonderful Mary Oliver, who we lost recently. And this one's called "The Chance to Love Everything." She says, "All summer I made friends with the creatures nearby. They flowed through the fields and under the tent walls, or padded through the door, grinning through their many teeth looking for seeds. Suet, sugar, muttering and humming, opening the bread box, happiest when there was milk and music. But once in the night I heard a sound outside the door. The canvas bulged slightly. Something was pressing inward at eye level. I watched, trembling, sure I had heard the click of claws, the smack of lips outside my gauzy house. I imagined the red eyes, the broad tongue, the enormous lap. Would it be friendly too? Fear defeated me, and yet not in faith and not in madness, but with courage I thought my dream deserved. I stepped outside. It was gone. Then I whirled at the sound of some shambling tonnage. Did I see a black haunch slipping back through the trees? Did I see the moonlight shining on it? Did I actually reach out my arms toward paradise falling like the fading of the dearest, wildest hope, the dark heart of the story that is all the reason for its telling? So let's just sit for a minute and then we'll see if there's any questions or comments. Yes, Beck, wait for the mic.
So somewhere near the middle, I think, of your talk, you said something about the first arrow and the second arrow. Is that right?
Yes.
Will you say a little more about arrows?
Yes. So the Buddha taught that the first arrow is what happens to us in life. It's our experience of life. It's aging, death, illness, loss, whatever. And there's really nothing we can do about it. It's just, it is what it is. But the second arrow is something over which we have some control and we can do something about. And that's the stories that we tell ourselves about that first arrow and the way we ruminate about it or obsess about it or beat ourselves up about it. And so if I have a fearful response, I have a fearful response. But if I then tell myself that I'm weak, defective, destined to be fearful my whole life, whatever, that's the part that is going to cause me the real suffering, and that's the part that the practice can help address. Other comments or questions? wait for Judy.
So, I guess I just wonder what the Buddha and modern psychology have to say about the kind of the three responses to a real event that is frightening. The freeze response, which seems to be followed by, instead of feeling all these intense feelings, not feeling them.
Numbing and dissociation.
Yeah, and so how to work with that skillfully with Buddhist practice?
Good question. Again, I think my first thought is to go to the body again, to check in, because I think one antidote to the numbing is, did everyone hear Anne-Marie's question? One antidote to the numbing is to check in with what you're feeling physically, not so much what you're feeling emotionally. So my heart's racing or my palms are sweating or whatever, anything to ground me, to kind of bring me, to touch the ground as the Buddha did with Mara. And see if that doesn't bring us back into more direct experience. Ideally, those experiences would be rare, but we know with trauma that they're not. They're all too common with trauma. And with people that are post-traumatic, they can become chronic and persistent. So I'm not sure Buddhist practice alone is going to be sufficient, maybe part of the picture, but I think some good psychotherapy is going to be in order as well, and a good mental health evaluation if you're having that kind of experience, other than just an acute, momentary experience that passes. If it becomes chronic and persistent, I think it's really time to get some professional involved. Yes, wait for the mic if you would.
Hello. I think a lot of times in the past I was doing things that weren't very helpful for me. When I'd feel a strong emotion, I'd switch to the breathing, concentrate on the breathing. But in a way, that's avoiding being in touch with the emotion. So that's not, if it feels unbearable, maybe that would lessen it, like touching the ground.
Right.
But ideally, we want to feel the...
we want to be with it, correct.
Right, rather than switch focus.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
But I think your point is well made about if it becomes unbearable. I mean, there's a limit to how much we can endure. And if it's overwhelming, then we go to the body in a way that doesn't worry so much about what else is going on, because I need to get grounded at that point. Yes, Betty. Wait for Judy.
So I'm thinking about what she just said about going to the breath after fear might arise in your mind. And I'm wondering, because in this kind of meditation we're doing, there are different kinds of meditation. So some meditation will be training you in to be more concentrated. So I'm wondering, if you're just watching what's coming into your mind and you're watching thoughts about the future, thoughts about the past, you're watching emotions, you're watching fear, and if you're just watching things come and go, wouldn't coming back to the breath be a way to be practicing?
Yeah, because we don't want to, as that stuff comes up, we don't want to be latching on and identifying with it. We want to just watch it arise and pass. And so coming back to the breath kind of is like a way of touching the ground, if you will. It's an anchoring way to practice. So I think that's what you're saying.
Right. So you wouldn't necessarily go into the fear then, just stay with the fear. And
correct.
You would just notice, fear is arising.
Exactly.
And then you come into the breath. You could come into the breath.
Breath. It's like Ajahn Sumedho said, fear is like this at this moment. That's what I'm experiencing. And just note it.
Right.
Don't identify with it. Right. Don't try not to grab it or let it grab you, and then come back to the breath.
So that idea of just creating some space around it in a way.
Yes, that's how we create space.
Right, yeah. Okay, great. Thanks.
Good.
If we know fear is there, we can let it go as soon
Sure. You know, easier said than done sometimes. Krista.
Just to kind of expand on that too, I think there's a certain level of, paying attention to what's happening in the body and honoring it, and the actual act of breathing can shift things. Like actually change something physiologically that is real and is happening as you're reacting to something. So, I think my sister was telling me that the action of chewing or moving your mouth actually touches works the vagus nerve and can physiologically actually shift things for you, or kind of massaging right here, taking deep breaths, or
all of that. Yeah. Anything that activates the parasympathetic half of the autonomic nervous system, the rest and the digest part. Right. And so chewing is part of the digest, so it can, as can slowing the breathing consciously activates it. I mean, all of these things are tools that we have available to
and at the same time, you can still be acknowledging, this is where I am.
This is what
fear.
This is.
This is what this is. It doesn't have to be one or the other, I don't think.
No, good point. Well said. Thank you.
I think perhaps a point that hasn't been mentioned that I've found helpful myself, that I learned through Nathaniel Brandon, is that he said that when you feel fear, you can actually thank it for being there. It's trying to tell you something that you need to know. And when I first heard that, I said, wow, I really like that.
Yes, it's a messenger, huh? Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Now that I can breathe, I'm going to just try to briefly tell you what happened just before I came tonight. As I opened my front door to leave the house to come here, I was met by my neighbor, who's a police officer, and he said, "I need to talk to you." And I said, "Sorry, I got to go." And he said, "No, it's important." And he said, "Okay, I want you to take a deep breath." And I instantly thought, my husband's dead, because that's how I operate. And then he said, "There's been a shooting at your son's college campus, and 3 people have been shot." And I was off to the races, and called my son, was able to reach him, and he said it's fine. It turns out that he had the police officer had the wrong UNC campus, so there has been a shooting, but not at my son's campus. And honestly, even though he was fine and I talked to him, this system was just on overdrive the whole drive here. The whole time I was talking, I could not quiet my heart, my breath. So what I ended up doing is I put my hand on my heart, and that was somewhat helpful. Then I went outside, because I actually work with people with trauma, so I know that I needed to expel some of it. So I went outside and I shook and I stomped my feet, and I think that was helpful. And then when I came back, I returned to just loving kindness, and I had such an overwhelming sense of, I just went a teeny tiny bit down the path that so many parents have had to go all the way down. And I had such a, not only gratitude that was not my path, but also I just felt such a connection and such a, the whole interdependence thing of, it is all our kids, it is me. And so I think there was really something about just opening my heart that both calmed it and helped somehow.
Thanks for sharing that, Barb. Yeah, I think you illustrate some of the things we were talking about. Certainly grounding and loving kindness. Thank you. Okay, grab a snack on the way out. Help us finish them. We'll see you next week.